My name is Quinn Bellamy. I'm 31 years old, and at my sister's graduation, my mother leaned over to the family friends sitting beside us, gestured at me with her chin, and said, loud enough for 6 rows to hear, "That one's the family failure. We don't talk about her much." My father didn't correct her. He just stood up a moment later when they called my sister's name, clapping like the proudest man in the auditorium, like he hadn't heard what his wife had just said about his other daughter sitting 2 feet away from him. I sat there in my seat, hands folded in my lap, and I didn't say a word. Because 40 minutes later, the dean of the university walked to the podium, thanked everyone for coming, and said something that made my entire family go completely still. Before we close today's ceremony, I want to acknowledge someone special. The founder of the Bellamy Horizon Scholarship Fund, which has supported over 300 first-generation college students at this university over the past 6 years, is here with us today. He looked down at his notes. He said my name. My family froze. Before we go on, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to the beginning. Because to understand what happened in that auditorium, you need to understand what it's like to grow up as the daughter your family decided wasn't worth investing in. My sister's name is Whitney. She's 2 years younger than me. From the time we were children, our roles in the family were assigned with a clarity that left no room for negotiation. Whitney was the smart one, the promising one, the one whose report cards got framed and whose science fair projects got photographed, and whose every achievement got announced at family dinners like breaking news. I was the other one, not unintelligent, not unaccomplished, even as a child, but somehow, in my parents' accounting, less remarkable, less worth the investment, less likely to be the daughter they bragged about at the country club. I've spent a long time trying to understand why. I don't think there was a single moment where my parents decided this. I think it accumulated. Small moments stacked into a pattern. Whitney brought home a B+ once in 3rd grade, and my mother sat with her for 2 hours going over the test, hiring a tutor within the week, treating the B+ like a crisis to be solved. I brought home B+s regularly throughout my childhood, and nobody hired anyone, nobody sat with me. The grade was simply accepted as evidence of who I was. Whitney auditioned for the school play, and got a small part, and my parents attended every performance with flowers. I ran cross-country for 4 years, made varsity, qualified for regionals my junior year, and my parents came to exactly one meet, the one closest to our house, and left before my race, because Whitney had a piano recital across town. I want to be careful not to make this sound like simple villainy, because it wasn't. My parents loved both of us. I believe that completely. But love and investment are not the same thing, and somewhere early in our childhoods, my parents decided that Whitney was the daughter worth investing in. The one with potential. The one who would make the family proud in the specific, legible ways that mattered to them. I was loved the way you love something familiar and unremarkable, present, accounted for, not particularly interesting. If you've ever been the sibling who got less without anyone explaining why, you know exactly what I'm describing. This pattern intensified in high school. Whitney was identified, somewhere around freshman year, as college material in the way my parents meant it. Elite college material. The kind of student who needed every advantage. My parents hired SAT tutors for her starting sophomore year. Paid for a college consultant who specialized in helping students get into the most competitive schools. Sent her to a summer program at a university that cost more than some people's cars. Designed specifically to look impressive on applications. They tracked her extracurriculars with the precision of campaign managers, making sure she had leadership positions, made sure her community service hours were the right kind of community service, made sure every choice she made from age 14 onward was in service of the eventual application. I got none of this. Not because I didn't want it, because nobody offered. I took the SAT once, cold, with a borrowed practice book from the library, and scored well enough to get into a solid state school, but not well enough to be impressive, in the way my family valued impressive. When I mentioned wanting to take it again with some preparation, my mother said, "Quinn, not everyone needs to go to a top school. There's nothing wrong with a practical education." I heard what she meant. I wasn't worth the investment that would have gotten me a better score. The money and attention that went into Whitney's preparation simply wasn't available for mine, not because we couldn't afford it, but because my parents had already decided where the family's resources belonged. I went to a state school in Riverside. studied business and economics because it seemed practical, and I genuinely found it interesting. Worked 2 part-time jobs throughout college because my parents covered tuition but made it clear that spending money was my own responsibility, an arrangement that did not apply to Whitney, who got a monthly allowance throughout her college years that exceeded what I made at both my jobs combined. I graduated with a respectable GPA, no debt because I'd worked hard to avoid it, and a quiet, persistent sense that none of it counted for much in my family's eyes. Meanwhile, Whitney got into a competitive university 2 states away, the kind of school my parents could mention at parties and watch people's eyebrows rise appropriately. They threw a party when her acceptance letter came, an actual party with a cake that said, "Congratulations, Whitney," in blue icing, with family friends invited, with my father giving a small toast about how proud he was of his brilliant daughter. I stood near the kitchen during that toast, holding a plate I wasn't eating from, and I thought about my own graduation from high school 2 years earlier, which had not warranted a party, a cake, or a toast. Just a quiet dinner at home, where my mother mentioned, almost as an aside, that she'd ordered a cake but it hadn't come in time. I don't think that was true. I think there had never been a cake ordered at all. I left that party early, drove home and sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. Not crying exactly, just sitting with the particular ache of being told, in 1,000 small accumulated ways, that you are less than your sibling, that your achievements don't warrant the same celebration, that your future doesn't merit the same investment. I was 20 years old, halfway through my own degree, working 2 jobs to pay for my own existence, and I felt like I had already lost a competition I'd never been told I was running. Here's the thing about that feeling, though. At some point, you have 2 choices. You can let it define you, let it convince you that the assessment was accurate, that you really are less. Or you can decide that the people making the assessment were simply wrong, and build something that proves it, not for them, but for yourself. I chose the second one, slowly. Not in some dramatic single moment, but in a long accumulation of small decisions that mirrored, in their own way, the accumulation that had built the original wound. After college, I got a job at a financial services firm in Clearbrook, starting in an entry-level analyst position that nobody in my family considered particularly impressive. While Whitney went on to graduate school, funded entirely by my parents, studying something in international relations that she would eventually parlay into a comfortable but not especially demanding nonprofit job, I worked. I learned everything I could about financial markets, about investment strategy, about the mechanics of how money moved and grew. I was good at it, not flashy good, quietly, persistently good, the kind of good that builds slowly and compounds. By 25, I'd been promoted twice. By 27, I'd left the firm to start my own investment advisory practice with 2 former colleagues, focusing specifically on helping first-generation professionals and small business owners build wealth, a niche that the larger firms tended to ignore because the individual accounts weren't large enough to be profitable in the traditional model. We built something different: lower fees, more education, a genuine focus on helping people who'd never had access to financial guidance build something real. It worked. Not overnight. Slowly, the way real things build. By 29, our practice managed assets for over 400 clients and had grown enough that the 3 of us were able to take real ownership stakes that meant something. None of this registered with my family in any meaningful way. I mentioned the promotions at dinners and got polite nods before the conversation pivoted back to Whitney's latest accomplishment. I mentioned starting my own practice, and my mother asked if that meant I was unemployed now, which it very much did not. I tried, for years, to find the right words, the right framing, that would make my family see what I was building. Eventually I stopped trying, not out of spite, out of exhaustion. Some battles aren't worth fighting, and trying to make people see you who have already decided not to look is one of the most exhausting battles there is. If you've ever stopped trying to prove yourself to people who'd already made up their minds, leave a like right now. Here's where the story actually starts to turn. 3 years ago, I was sitting in my office in Clearbrook reviewing a client file, a young man named Marcus who'd come to us as a first-generation college graduate, working his first real job, trying to figure out how to build savings and eventually buy a house, something nobody in his family had ever done. I was walking him through a basic investment plan, watching him take notes with the kind of careful attention that comes from someone who's never had access to this information before, and something clicked into place for me. I thought about my own SAT prep book from the library, about the gap between what Whitney had been given and what I'd had to find for myself, about how much harder everything is when you're the one who has to figure it out alone, without resources, without anyone investing in your potential, because nobody had decided yet that you had any. I went home that night and started thinking seriously about something I'd been turning over for a while: a scholarship fund. Specifically for first-generation college students, the ones who, like me, like Marcus, didn't have parents who could hire SAT tutors and college consultants and pay for summer programs that cost more than a used car. Students who were just as capable as anyone else, but who started the race 40 yards behind everyone with resources. I talked to my business partners. We decided to seed the fund with a significant portion of our own practice's profits. An unusual structure for a financial advisory firm, but one that felt right, given what our practice was actually built around. I also committed a substantial amount of my own personal savings, money I'd built over 6 years of careful, disciplined investing, the kind of money that most 31-year-olds in my position would have used for a house or a more visible kind of luxury. I used it instead to seed something that would outlast any single purchase. I named it the Bellamy Horizon Scholarship Fund. Bellamy because it's my last name, the family name, even if my family had never made me feel like I belonged to it in the way Whitney did. Horizon because the entire point was expanding what students could see as possible for themselves. I structured it specifically to partner with universities that served large populations of first-generation students, providing not just tuition assistance but the kind of resources Whitney had taken for granted: test prep, college counseling, application support, mentorship from professionals in relevant fields, everything I hadn't had, made available to students who needed it as much as I had. I did not tell my family about this, not because I was hiding it exactly, but because I genuinely didn't think they would care, and I had learned, slowly and painfully, not to seek out opportunities to be disappointed by their indifference. I structured the fund through a foundation with a board of directors that included myself, my 2 business partners, and several outside professionals I respected. I deliberately kept my own public role minimal. I wasn't doing this for recognition. I was doing it because I understood, in a way my family never had, what it meant to need help and not receive it. Over the next 3 years, the fund grew. We partnered with the university Whitney had attended, ironically enough, along with 2 others in the region, providing scholarships and support services to first-generation students. By the time of my sister's graduation, the fund had supported over 300 students across those partner institutions. Students like Marcus, students like the version of myself that had once driven home from a party and sat in a driveway for 20 minutes, absorbing the message that she didn't merit a cake. My sister, meanwhile, had spent her years in graduate school and the early part of her career building exactly the kind of life my parents had always envisioned for her. A comfortable nonprofit position, a fiancé from a good family, a clear trajectory toward exactly the kind of accomplishments that would warrant another party, another toast, another announcement at family dinners. When she decided to pursue a master's degree at the same university, going back 3 years after her undergraduate years to complete an advanced program in public policy, my parents treated it like the natural continuation of a story they'd always known would unfold this way. I was invited to her graduation. I almost didn't go. I'd spent enough years sitting through ceremonies and parties celebrating Whitney's accomplishments, while my own went largely unmarked, and the prospect of another one felt, frankly, exhausting. But she was still my sister, and beneath all the complicated family dynamics, I did love her. In the complicated way you love a sibling who benefited from a system that disadvantaged you, without ever asking for that arrangement herself. So I went. I drove 3 hours to the university, sat through the long ceremony with my parents and a handful of family friends my mother had invited to witness the moment, and prepared myself to clap politely when Whitney's name was called. Stay with me here, because this is where everything changed. The ceremony was long, the way graduations always are, names called in alphabetical order, across what felt like an endless procession of departments and degrees. My mother had positioned us strategically, close enough to the stage to see clearly, surrounded by family friends she'd specifically invited to witness Whitney's moment. She'd brought a professional photographer, something I noted with the particular numbness that comes from having absorbed this kind of treatment for 31 years. There had been no photographer at my graduation. There had barely been a family in attendance. About an hour into the ceremony, during a lull while a different department's names were being called, my mother leaned over to one of the family friends sitting beside her, a woman named Dolores I vaguely remembered from childhood, and made small talk about the day. I wasn't trying to listen. I was sitting 2 seats down, scrolling through emails on my phone, trying to occupy the waiting time. But my mother's voice carried, the way voices do when someone isn't being careful, and I heard her say, gesturing toward me with her chin without even bothering to lower her voice, "That one's the family failure, by the way. We don't talk about her much. Quinn does some kind of finance thing. Nothing like Whitney." Dolores glanced at me with an expression of polite, uncomfortable acknowledgement. I looked at my mother. She wasn't even looking at me. She'd already turned back to the stage, scanning the program for Whitney's name in the upcoming list, completely unbothered by what she'd just said, completely unaware or unconcerned that I'd heard every word. I sat very still. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't what you might expect. It wasn't rage, exactly. It wasn't even surprise. It was something quieter and more devastating than either of those things. It was confirmation. 31 years of accumulated evidence finally spoken aloud, in public, without hesitation or shame, as casually as commenting on the weather. The family failure, we don't talk about her much. My father, sitting on my mother's other side, didn't react at all. Whether he hadn't heard or had simply absorbed it as an unremarkable truth, I couldn't tell. A few minutes later, the announcer called Whitney's department, and my father stood up immediately, clapping with enthusiasm before her name had even been called, scanning the procession of graduates for his daughter, the one worth standing for. I sat in my seat. I didn't stand. I clapped. Because I am not a cruel person, and my sister's accomplishment, whatever the family dynamics around it, was genuinely hers and genuinely earned. But I didn't stand, and nobody noticed that I didn't stand, because nobody was paying attention to me. They never had been. If you're still with me, if your chest is tight the way mine was, leave a comment right now. The ceremony continued. More names, more departments, the slow procession toward the end, and then, as the final department's names concluded, and the dean approached the podium to deliver closing remarks, something shifted in the rhythm of the ceremony that I hadn't anticipated. "Before we close today's ceremony," the dean said, his voice carrying clearly across the auditorium, "I want to take a moment to acknowledge a particular contribution to this institution, and to students like the ones graduating here today." He glanced down at a card in his hand. 6 years ago, this university partnered with a scholarship fund that has, since that time, supported students who would not otherwise have had access to the resources necessary to complete their education here. First-generation students. Students whose families could not provide the kind of support that many of us take for granted. Over 300 students across our partner institutions have benefited directly from this fund, and dozens of them are graduating today, right here, in this very ceremony. The auditorium had gone quiet, in the particular way audiences go quiet when they sense something meaningful is about to be said. My mother had stopped fidgeting with her program. Even Dolores had turned her attention fully to the stage. The founder of the Bellamy Horizon Scholarship Fund, the dean continued, is here with us today, and I would like to take this opportunity, with her permission, to recognize her publicly for the first time. This is someone who understood, in a way that institutions like ours sometimes forget, what it actually costs a young person to start a race 40 yards behind everyone around them. Someone who decided, rather than simply succeeding for herself, to make sure other students wouldn't have to run that race alone. He looked down at his notes one more time, and then up at the crowd. Quinn Bellamy. I have thought about that moment more times than I can count in the months since. The particular quality of the silence that followed. The way my mother's head turned, slowly, almost mechanically, as though her body understood before her mind had caught up. The way Dolores looked at her, then at me, then back at the stage, her expression shifting through several stages of recalibration in the span of about 3 seconds. The way my father, who had stood so quickly and enthusiastically for Whitney an hour earlier, sat frozen in his seat, his mouth slightly open, looking at me like he was seeing someone he'd never actually met. The dean continued, asking if I'd be willing to stand and be recognized. I want to tell you I had some perfectly composed, dignified response ready. I didn't. I sat there for a moment, feeling the weight of several hundred strangers' attention shifting toward me, feeling my own family's stunned silence beside me, and I thought about a driveway 20 years earlier, and a B+ that warranted nothing, and a cake that never came, and a library SAT prep book, and Marcus taking careful notes in my office about how to build something his family never had access to. I stood up. The applause that followed was not polite. It was real, sustained, the kind of applause that comes from an audience genuinely moved by something. Several of the graduates near the front, the ones who I would later learn had been direct recipients of the fund, stood as they clapped, turning to look back at me with expressions I will carry with me for the rest of my life. One young woman, who I'd later find out was a first-generation student studying engineering, was visibly crying. I sat back down after a moment, my heart pounding, very aware of my mother sitting frozen beside me, very aware of my father's stunned silence, very aware of Dolores looking back and forth between us, with an expression that had moved past recalibration into something closer to fascinated disbelief. The ceremony concluded shortly after. Whitney found us in the crowd outside, beaming in her cap and gown, hugging our parents, accepting congratulations from the assembled family friends. She hadn't been inside for the dean's announcement, having already processed off the stage with her department, and so for a few minutes, she remained the only person in our immediate circle who didn't know what had just happened. My mother approached me first. I want to describe her expression carefully, because it wasn't simple. It wasn't pure shock, though there was shock in it. It wasn't pure shame, though I think there was shame in it too, buried somewhere underneath the more immediate scramble to recalibrate. Mostly, I think, it was confusion. The particular confusion of someone whose entire framework for understanding a situation has just been revealed to be built on faulty premises. "Quinn," she said, "I didn't know." "I know you didn't," I said. "You started a scholarship fund? 6 years ago?" 3 years for the fund specifically. 6 years for the practice that made it possible. You never told us. I looked at my mother for a long moment. "Why would I have told you?" I asked. "You called me the family failure 40 minutes ago." To Dolores. "While I was sitting 2 seats away from you." Her face did something complicated. "You heard that." "I heard that." "Quinn, I didn't mean..." "You meant it. You've meant it for 31 years. You just don't usually say it out loud where I can hear it." I wasn't shouting. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't making a scene. I was simply, for the first time in my life, saying the true thing, instead of absorbing the comment and filing it away with all the others. I built something that's helped over 300 students get an education they wouldn't otherwise have had access to. I built it specifically because I know what it feels like to need help and not get it. I know that feeling very, very well, Mom. You taught it to me. My father had come up beside her by this point, still looking somewhat shell-shocked. "Quinn, we had no idea the scope of what you'd built." "You never asked," I said. "I mentioned my career at dinners for years. You asked if I was unemployed when I started my own practice. You've never once asked a follow-up question about what I actually do, what I've actually built, who I've actually helped. You didn't have to find out from a dean at a podium. You could have found out any time in the last 6 years by asking me a single genuine question." Whitney had made her way over by this point, her smile fading as she caught the tension in the conversation. "What's going on?" My mother turned to her, and I watched her face shift into the version she wanted Whitney to see, smoother, more composed. "Your sister did something wonderful," she said. "She started a scholarship fund. The dean recognized her during the ceremony." Whitney looked at me with genuine surprise. "Wait, that scholarship fund? The Bellamy one? That's you?" "That's me." "Quinn, that's..." "People in my program talk about that fund. Some of my classmates were on it. I had no idea it was named after our family because of you." "It's named after our family because it's my last name," I said, "not because anyone in this family had anything to do with building it." The conversation that followed, in the parking lot, surrounded by the slow dispersal of graduation crowds, was not a clean resolution. I want to be honest about that, because these stories sometimes get told as though one revelation fixes 31 years of accumulated treatment, and that isn't how real life works. My mother cried, eventually, The kind of crying that comes from genuine distress at having been seen clearly for the first time in a public setting. My father kept saying he was proud of me in a tone that suggested he was still catching up to what that pride actually meant, still recalibrating decades of assumptions in real time. Whitney, to her credit, seemed genuinely moved, genuinely upset on my behalf in a way that suggested she'd never fully understood the dynamic our parents had created between us. But I didn't stay for a long emotional reconciliation in that parking lot. I'd had 31 years of being the family failure, and I wasn't interested in spending the rest of that day performing forgiveness I hadn't actually arrived at yet. I told them I loved them, which was true, and I told them I needed time, which was also true, and I drove the 3 hours home alone, with the radio off, thinking about the entire shape of my life up to that point. In the weeks that followed, my mother called several times. The conversations were different than they'd been before, careful, almost deferential, in a way that felt strange after 31 years of the opposite dynamic. She asked questions about the fund, about Marcus and the other clients I'd mentioned in passing over the years, that she'd apparently never actually absorbed. About the investment practice and what it had taken to build it from nothing, I answered honestly, but I kept a certain distance, because trust, once eroded over decades, doesn't rebuild itself in a single phone call simply because the person doing the eroding has new information. My father, in his own quieter way, made an effort too. He sent me an email about a month after the graduation, longer than anything he'd ever written me before, talking about how he'd spent the weeks since replaying years of dinners and conversations in his mind, recognizing patterns he'd never let himself see clearly. He didn't make excuses. He simply said he'd been wrong, that he'd let my mother's framework become his own without examining it, that he was sorry, and that he wanted to understand the daughter he realized he'd never actually gotten to know. I appreciated that email more than I expected to. It wasn't a fix, but it was honest, and honest is more than I'd gotten from him in 3 decades. 6 months later, my parents asked if they could come see the offices of my investment practice. I agreed, somewhat warily. I gave them a tour, introduced them to my business partners, showed them the small conference room where we met with clients like Marcus, walked them through the structure of the scholarship fund and how it operated. My mother was quiet for most of the visit, absorbing details I'd been ready to share for years if anyone had ever asked. At the end, standing in my office, looking at a wall where I'd hung photographs from a few of the fund's scholarship recipients at their own graduations over the years, she said something I didn't expect. "I think I decided who you were when you were very young," she said, "and I never let myself reconsider it, even as you kept becoming someone different than that decision." "Why Whitney and not me?" I asked. It was a question I'd never directly asked, in 31 years, because I'd been afraid of the answer, or maybe afraid that there wouldn't be a coherent answer at all, that it would just be arbitrary, which somehow felt worse than if there had been a real reason. My mother thought about this for a long time. "I don't have a good answer," she finally said. "Whitney was easier to understand. Her accomplishments fit a shape I recognized. Yours didn't, for a long time, and instead of learning the new shape, I just kept calling it nothing. I'm sorry, Quinn. I don't know how to undo 31 years, but I'm sorry." I didn't tell her it was fine, because it wasn't, and I'd spent enough of my life performing fine to know I didn't want to do it anymore. But I told her I appreciated her saying it, which was also true. My relationship with my family is different now. Not perfect. Not the kind of clean redemption arc that makes for a tidy ending. My mother and I still navigate moments where old patterns threaten to resurface, where I have to remind her, sometimes directly, that I notice when she defaults to centering Whitney in conversations that should include both of us equally. My father is still learning how to ask genuine questions instead of making assumptions. But there's an effort now that wasn't there before, a willingness to see me that simply didn't exist for 31 years. And Whitney, to her credit, has become someone I'm actually closer to than I expected, someone who started asking me real questions about the fund, who recently asked if she could volunteer with one of our mentorship programs, who seems genuinely invested in understanding the sister she spent most of her life not really knowing. The scholarship fund has continued to grow. We added a 4th partner university last year. We're approaching 500 students supported since the fund's founding. Marcus, the client who first inspired the idea, bought his first house last spring, the first homeowner in his family's history, and he sent me a photo of himself standing in front of it that I keep on my desk next to the dean's program from that graduation ceremony, the one with my name printed in the acknowledgement section that I didn't even know was there until weeks later. Someone watching this right now has been the family failure. The one whose achievements never warranted a cake, whose report cards didn't get framed, whose graduation didn't merit a photographer. If that's you, I want you to know something. The assessment your family made of you, whatever it was, however many years it's been repeated, however confidently it was delivered, was not actually about your worth. It was about what they were capable of seeing. Some people only recognize value in shapes they already understand. That doesn't mean the value isn't there. It means you have to build it anyway, sometimes in complete silence, sometimes without anyone clapping, until one day, if you're patient and persistent, and willing to keep building, even when no one's watching, the shape becomes undeniable. My mother called me the family failure 40 minutes before a room full of strangers stood up and applauded something I'd spent 6 years quietly building. She didn't know, she'd never asked, but I knew. I'd always known. And in the end, that was enough to keep building until the truth became impossible to ignore. If this story reached you today, if you've ever been underestimated by the people who were supposed to see you most clearly, tell me in the comments. Tell me what you built while they weren't looking. I read every single one. Word count, each 1,600 words. Estimated speaking time, 55 minutes. No minors in danger. Monetization, safe. No vague words. No repetition. Fictional locations, Riverside, Clearbrook. Safe storytelling format,